Welcome back to Dark History for Sleep. Tonight we're traveling back to a time when power and madness danced together in the shadows of history, revealing one of the most disturbing reigns Rome has ever seen. As you settle in, beneath the hush of night, allow your mind to drift gently through the tale of Emperor Caligula, a ruler whose final days were as horrific as they were fascinating. Get comfortable, close your eyes, and prepare to be carried softly into a world where imperial grandeur met a terrifying descent into madness. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, though most know him simply as Caligula, was born in the year 12 AD into a line bursting with fame and tragedy. His very nickname, meaning little boot, derived from the miniature soldier's sandals he wore as a boy, accompanying his father Germanicus on military campaigns. Those early years, spent among the disciplined legions of Rome's frontiers, hinted at a childhood filled with both affection and the shadow of expectation. Yet it would be this mix, love, loss, and the heavy mantle of imperial history that laid the ground for the haunting downfall to come. When Caligula was just 7 years old, his father Germanicus died under suspicious circumstances. The young boy was left in a complicated web of political intrigue and family rivalries. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was a formidable woman who fought tirelessly to protect his claim to power. Yet even then, the world Caligula inhabited was steeped in danger. Accusations of treason, whispers of poisoning, and relentless pressure surrounded him. It was a childhood marked not just by privilege, but by the eerie early signs of instability that would later manifest in spine-chilling ways. The young Caligula's ascent to power was swift and unexpected. In the year 37 AD, upon the peaceful death of Emperor Tiberius, Caligula stepped onto the throne amid celebrations, joy, and high hopes for a renewed Rome. At first, his rule promised benevolence and charm. His populist gestures won favor with the people. He distributed bonuses to the soldiers, organized spectacular games, and seemed to embolden the city with a youthful energy. Yet behind the smiling facade lay a storm, gathering silently. As months passed, subtle changes began to appear. Caligula's behavior shifted from eccentric to unpredictable. His speeches wandered into strange realms. His decisions became erratic and at times cruelly capricious. The historical accounts, though often written by those who despised him, agree on a startling transformation that continued to deepen with each passing day. Some scholars suggest that an illness, perhaps encephalitis or epilepsy, may have triggered his decline. Others point to the immense stress of ruling an empire as a cause. Whatever the root, the man who had once thrilled Rome now sent shivers through its very core. Caligula's infamous cruelty took many forms. He delighted in humiliating senators, forcing them to grovel or participate in degrading spectacle. His palace became a stage for bizarre displays of power, a living theater where he enacted caprices that left courtiers terrified. He declared himself a living god, ordering temples to be built in his honor or demanding to be worshipped alongside Jupiter himself. These acts, blasphemous to the traditional Roman religious order, deepened the unease that gnawed at Rome's elite. Most disturbing, perhaps, were the whispers of violence within the walls of the imperial palace. Caligula's reign was marked by a series of brutal executions, many carried out on the flimsiest of pretexts. Friends and foes alike fell victim to his paranoia. Historical texts speak of nights pierced by screams and fear, when nobles vanished without trace, and the air was thick with the scent of betrayal. The emperor's own relatives were not spared, an ominous sign that no one, no matter how close, was safe from the flickering blade of his wrath. There are accounts, always soft-spoken in shadowed libraries, that describe his bizarre and disturbing relationship with his sister Drusilla. Their closeness alarmed contemporaries, and later gossip suggested relationships crossing boundaries seen as sacred. Whether based in truth or malicious rumor, these stories add to the haunting aura surrounding Caligula's court, painting a picture of a man whose private desires reflected the tumult within his mind. Meanwhile, the citizens of Rome watched their emperor's behavior with growing fear. Public works stalled, the treasury thinned from expensive wars and lavish banquets, and laws became caprices enforced by an unpredictable will. Yet, even as fear mounted, Caligula's grip on power persistently tightened. His Praetorian Guard, fiercely loyal or paralyzed by terror, maintained his dominance, while senators whispered darkly behind closed doors, nurturing plots that would eventually shatter the fragile peace. One episode, both shocking and telling, was Caligula's obsession with his horse Incitatus. The horse lived in marble stables, adorned with jewels, and reportedly had a dining room fitted with ivory furniture. The emperor jokingly, or perhaps seriously, threatened to appoint Incitatus as consul of Rome, the empire's highest elected office. This story, relayed through historical whispers, revealed not just eccentricity, but a twisted mockery of Rome's political system. It was a symbol of the emperor's descent, an unsettling blend of humor and cruelty. As Caligula's madness deepened, so did the reports of his unpredictable brutality. Sometimes he was said to throw banquets in which certain guests were secretly marked for death. At other times, he would force senators to fight against gladiators to prove their loyalty. These acts were not merely displays of cruelty, but terrifying games where the boundaries of life and death blurred into uncertainty. Within the golden walls of the palace, nothing was safe from his caprice. The physical and psychological toll that these final years exerted on Rome's imperial court was profound. Courtiers lived in constant fear, families tore themselves apart in efforts to survive, and the machinery of the empire creaked under the weight of chaos. The atmosphere was thick with tension, as if the very stones of the city held their breath, awaiting the inevitable conclusion of this horrifying chapter. Gradually, whispers of conspiracy grew louder. Even those closest to Caligula, the men sworn to protect him, began to question their loyalty. Behind the facade of grandiose madness, a deadly danger loomed, a plan birthed in fear and desperation. It was a secret design to reclaim Rome from the grip of terror, a plan that would bring the emperor's reign to a brutal end. As night falls upon this tale, and the unsettling reign of madness stretches on, we prepare to explore the final, harrowing days of Caligula's life. His story is a chilling reminder that even the brightest throne can cast the darkest shadow. Soon we will delve into the moments when power, madness, and fate collided in a climax as horrifying as it was inevitable. For now, rest your mind gently on the images of a Rome both glorious and broken, a city caught between myth and nightmare. And as we continue our journey into the depths of history's darker corners, know that the story of Caligula is far from over. Join me for the next chapter, where we will witness the final act in the tragic symphony of an emperor's descent. Sleep softly, and when you are ready, drift deeper into the story. As we continue to trace the final days of Emperor Caligula, the air around Rome grew dense with a silent dread, as if the city itself sensed the unraveling of a reign that had once promised so much. The emperor's behavior, once merely eccentric, now bordered on the terrifyingly erratic, blurring the lines between divine authority and unchecked madness with increasing boldness. One of the most haunting aspects of these last days was Caligula's relentless pursuit of power, expressed in ways that were as shocking as they were cruel. His demands escalated beyond mere demands for worship. He began to force the Senate into humiliating displays of loyalty. Senators who hesitated faced public mockery or worse. It wasn't simply about control anymore. It was about instilling terror, a twisted reminder that resistance would be met by swift and brutal reprisal. The palace walls, once a symbol of imperial authority and opulence, grew into a prison of fear. Those within its gilded corridors whispered of nightly torments, visions of Caligula wandering the halls at odd hours, muttering incomprehensible words, his gaze empty yet piercing. Slaves and guards alike spoke in hushed tones about the increasing number of executions carried out without trial, the silence following these acts as chilling as the acts themselves. Caligula's paranoia seemed to consume him entirely. Friends became suspects, confidants were watched, and even his closest relatives were not exempt from suspicion. A telltale sign of his spiraling madness was his treatment of those closest to him. His sister Drusilla, once a source of companionship, fell victim to his increasing cruelty. Some accounts suggest he tried to erase the boundaries of divine and mortal, seeing her in equal or even exalted status, an indication of the emperor's distorted view of family and power in these bleak times. Meanwhile, the people of Rome lived in a tense atmosphere of uncertainty. Public rituals, once grand and unifying, turned into grotesque displays orchestrated by the emperor to flaunt his absolute power. Caligula's extravagant spending had drained the treasury, yet he spared no expense on lavish games, feasts, and spectacles that served only to heighten the gulf between ruler and ruled. One particularly horrifying incident involved a grand festival where Caligula allegedly unveiled a new game that forced unarmed spectators into combat with gladiators. The purpose was not sport, but spectacle, a cruel test of obedience and terror. Historians reading the accounts note the thin veneer of sanity in these events. They were less about governance and more about breaking the spirit of those who might oppose him. As the emperor's mental state worsened, his whims verged on the grotesque. His obsession with the horse incitatus evolved beyond merely symbolic jest. It is said that Caligula might have attempted to elevate the animal in official capacity, a dark mockery not just of the political system, but of the very concept of leadership. This act unsettled Rome, an empire used to the grandeur of its leaders, now confronted by the absurdity masked beneath imperial decree. The Praetorian Guard, tasked with protecting the emperor, began to shift from loyalty to fear. Their initial admiration turned to anxiety born of uncertainty. In whispers, theories of conspiracy and mutiny drifted through the imperial quarters. Yet no one dared act openly, caught in a web woven from fear and the unpredictable wrath of a disturbed ruler. In this climate of suppressed dread, an event truly emblematic of Caligula's descent occurred during a journey to the city of Naples. Here, in a display that stunned even the hardiest observers, Caligula reputedly declared himself a living god, challenging even the mightiest of Rome's deities. His insistence that sacrifices be made in his honor at temples usually reserved for Jupiter and Mars scandalized priests and citizens alike. The very fabric of Roman religious and political life trembled under this audacity. Behind the facade of imperial divinity, more subtle signs of decay manifested. Caligula's physical health deteriorated, perhaps a reflection of the immense psychological burden he bore, or an illness long concealed from the public eye. His appearance became gaunt, his eyes hollow, and his once commanding voice often reduced to whispers, adding a sinister edge to his presence. As winter gave way to spring, the tension in Rome became palpable. Senators who once minutely applauded found solace only in whispered conversations behind opulent doors. For every loyalist, there were two who quietly hoped for an end to the chaos. And yet, outwardly, the empire maintained its semblance of order. Rome never paused, and life marched on, as if unable or unwilling to confront the rot at its core. In the final weeks before his demise, Caligula's actions grew more reckless. He committed acts of gratuitous cruelty, including ordering executions without pretext or trial, instilling a sense of arbitrary justice. These acts often occurred at night, shrouded in secrecy, amplifying the aura of mystery and fear surrounding his rule. The emperor seemed detached from reality, his edicts reflecting a mind slipping further into chaos. One particular story relates that Caligula once invited a group of senators to dinner, only to reveal halfway through the meal that some were marked for execution. Those spared were left trembling, their relief tempered by the knowledge that favor was as fragile as glass. Such episodes illustrate the cruel theater in which Caligula cast his courtiers, turning their survival into a precarious game of chance. The repeated humiliations and brutalities wore heavily on Rome's elite. Families once intertwined with imperial power began to fracture, as fear bred silence and suspicion. Cloaked plots and whispered alliances sprouted like weeds in the palace gardens, foretelling the inevitable uprising against the emperor. Amidst this roiling sea of dread, the personal life of Caligula became increasingly blurred with the political. His reported incestuous relationship with his sister Drusilla was not only a personal aberration, but a scandal that eroded the legitimacy of his rule. Though some historians debate the veracity of such claims, the very existence of these rumors fed the perception of moral decay within the highest sphere of power. As the days wore on, the Praetorian Guard's loyalty waned. The soldiers, once proud protectors, now contemplated the heavy cost of their service to a ruler who had become a symbol of madness and cruelty. Murmurs of conspiracy gathered strength. The idea of assassination, once unthinkable, became a whispered necessity among those who wished to save Rome from itself. Eventually, the tension that had gripped the city for so long reached a breaking point. The very people who had crowned Caligula now stood on the precipice of revolt, driven not by political ambition but by a desperate desire for peace. His erratic declarations, the statues in temples honoring his deified self, the lavish but cruel entertainments all combined into a portrait of a ruler whose power was both absolute and utterly unsustainable. The final days of Caligula's reign were marked by an eerie quietness, a calm before the storm. The emperor's increasing isolation and the palpable fear that clung to every corner of the palace signaled a nearing climax. Behind closed doors, The conspirators prepared, their plans etched in secret, fueled by the collective trauma inflicted by the emperor's reign. And so, as the empire held its breath, the threads of fate tightened around Caligula. His story, a tragic tapestry woven from ambition, madness, and cruelty, was about to reach its dark conclusion. The chilling symphony of an emperor's descent was nearing its final note. When we meet again for the next chapter, we will step into the shadowed halls of the imperial palace on that fateful day, where power and madness collided with deadly consequence. We will witness the unfolding of a plot born from desperation and fear, an act that would forever alter the course of Roman history. For now, as your eyes begin to settle and your thoughts drift gently toward rest, carry with you the image of an empire trembling under the weight of a man consumed by his own darkness. Let the quiet calm wash over this turbulent tale, and prepare to descend even deeper into the haunting final moments of Emperor Caligula. Sleep softly, and when you are ready, we will continue our journey together. In the shadowed corridors of the Palatine Hill, where marble met shadow and whispered fears echoed softly among the stone, the final days of Caligula's reign unfolded with a growing suffocation, as if the very air had thickened with dread. The emperor, once embraced by the hopes of a bright new Rome, now sat ensnared by his own spirals of madness and paranoia, a ruler more ghost than man. Each day brought with it new horrors, yet none so palpable as the creeping certainty that his time was drawing to a close. Caligula's behavior in this period became an unsettling blend of fragile delusion and terrifying command. His days were punctuated by sudden outbursts and strange obsessions. The emperor's stare, once lively and curious, had dulled into something vacant, like the eyes of a man lost in a labyrinth of his own mind. His voice, when he spoke, carried a hollow echo that unsettled those within earshot. The palace, which a short time before had been a stage for his grandeur and excess, now felt like a cage, both for him and for those who lived beneath his gaze. One cannot understand the depth of the horror without observing the delicate dance of fear and madness that Caligula imposed on his court. Senators who had once vied for his favor with calculated speeches and subtle flattery now navigated a minefield of uncertainty. One moment, a loyal gesture earned praise. The next, a misstep could be met with an icy glare or worse, an accusation that led swiftly to exile or death. This unpredictability was the essence of the emperor's growing terror, an atmosphere in which silence was both survival and surrender. Within this festering atmosphere, the legend of Incitatus, the emperor's favored horse, took on a grim significance. The luxurious treatment of the animal, its marble stable, purple blankets, and fine food, was no longer a mere oddity or jest. It became a dark symbol of Caligula's contempt for the very institutions he ruled. The whispers ran rampant, suggesting that elevating a horse to the rank of consul was less mockery and more a deliberate effort to unnerve the Senate, a chilling reminder that folly and authority could intertwine lethally. As if this were not enough, Caligula's relationships became clouded in rumor and sorrow. His sister Drusilla, once rumored to command his affection beyond the bounds of custom, was now a shadow. Historical accounts vary, but many suggest her death in these final days struck a devastating blow to the emperor's fragile psyche. Some sources hint that her passing plunged him deeper into despair, twisting his grief into acts that further isolated him from reason. The loss of Drusilla marked not only a personal tragedy, but also a shattering of one of the few emotional anchors he still possessed. The court, already living on edge, felt this loss like a shudder reverberating through its halls. Caligula's cruel games became more frequent and secretive. Dinner parties turned into grim exercises in survival, where courtiers would try to interpret the emperor's shifting moods, fearing whether favor or death awaited them. The unpredictability was itself a weapon, a psychological torment that broke down alliances and bred distrust. It seemed as if Caligula's reign was built not on loyalty, but on fragile threads of terror, ready to snap under the weight of his growing instability. Paranoia weighed heavier with each passing night. Guards once devoted began to exchange guarded glances, their hands twitching near the hilts of their swords. They whispered among themselves, knowing that the emperor's delusions had birthed enemies in every shadow, real or imagined. No one could say who might be next on the list. Friends, family, even the emperor's own praetorian prefect understood that the line between protector and executioner was perilously thin. Amid the dim glow of flickering torches, Caligula's proclamations grew bolder and increasingly unsettling. He insisted on rituals that blurred divine prerogative and monarchic rule. Temples to himself sprouted alongside those dedicated to Jupiter, and festivals celebrated not Rome's gods but Caligula himself. Such acts were sacrilegious to many and terrifying to others, insolent harbingers of a ruler who was no longer tethered to the traditions that had maintained Roman order for centuries. It was as though the emperor sought to remake reality around the axis of his own image, indifferent to the fractures it caused. Yet of all the horrific episodes that marked these closing days, perhaps the darkest was the rise in executions carried out without trial or accusation. Men who had once stood proudly in the Senate or commanded legions were dragged away in the night, their fates sealed behind closed doors. The palace echoed with muffled cries, muffled not just by walls but by the growing silence within Rome itself, a silence born of fear and grief. These deaths were not public punishments meant to deter rebellion. They were private erasures, wiped clean without explanation, leaving behind only whispers of terror. As we reflect on these grim days, it is important to remember that the turmoil was not limited to political power plays. The personal destruction wrought by Caligula's unraveling mind bled outward, poisoning the relationships and institutions that had once formed the backbone of the empire. The fabric of Roman society stretched thin, tugged by the twin forces of a ruler's madness and the people's growing despair. These fractures were keenly felt within his own family. Caligula's wife, Caesonia, though said to have borne him a daughter, lived in a state of constant dread. Close like the shadow she hung in, she rarely emerged from the imperial private chambers, shielded from the worst of Caligula's public spectacles, but powerless to halt the disintegration growing around her. Their daughter, born amidst this chaos, was a fragile ray of hope caught in the storm's eye, unaware of the legacy her lineage carried. Meanwhile, the Senate's patience had thinned to a dangerous whisper. Many senators, once hopeful for a peaceful reign, now plotted quietly, weighing the cost of resistance against the rising terror. They were men steeped in the traditions of Rome, trapped between reverence for imperial authority and revulsion at Caligula's abuses. The fear that even the Praetorian Guard might turn against them was real, but so was the collective burden of enduring a reign so fragile and grotesque that it threatened the very soul of Rome. It was in this atmosphere that conspiracies took root, delicate plans passed in whispers, secret gatherings held under the watchful eyes of the city's shadows. The assassins were few but determined, their motives a tangled web of patriotism, survival, and vengeance. They were united by a grim purpose: to end the emperor's reign before the empire broke irreparably beneath the weight of his insanity. On the eve of the final act, the city itself seemed to hold its breath. Night blankets settled quietly over Rome, muffling the murmur of preparations and the heavy footsteps of men who carried the fate of history in their hands. Caligula, isolated within his gilded prison, remained oblivious, or perhaps resigned, to the edgeless threat closing in around him. The palace, once a realm of laughter and song, echoed only with the faint rustle of shadows moving closer toward an inescapable end. As this chapter of Caligula's life neared its dark conclusion, one cannot help but ponder the fragile interplay between power and madness, how the trappings of an empire can both elevate and imprison a man. His story is a haunting echo down the corridors of time, a reminder that beneath the gilded masks of leadership often lie the deepest vulnerabilities, and sometimes the most terrifying madness. When dawn breaks in our next chapter, we will step quietly into that fateful morning, where conspirators enacted their deadly work, and the fate of the empire shifted forever. There, behind the palace doors, the final curtain on Caligula's terrifying symphony will fall, revealing the stark consequences of unchecked power and deranged ambition. Rest now, letting the muted sounds of ancient Rome fade softly away. And when you are ready, we will journey together deeper into the shadow of an emperor's fall, where history's darkest moments unfold with a whisper, and the past's solemn warnings hum gently beneath the quiet night. In the growing shadow of his empire, Caligula's final days unfolded like a slow descent into a haunting silence, broken only by the faint echoes of a fractured mind. The weight of the purple robes seemed heavier with each passing hour, yet the man beneath them had become ghostly, a figure more consumed by shadows than flesh and blood. His court, once vibrant and bustling with the urgent rhythms of imperial life, now murmured in hushed tones, each whisper laden with a mixture of fear, pity, and inevitable dread. The emperor's health, frail as it was, seemed to mirror his unraveling spirit. His complexion, once flushed with the vigor of youth, waned to a pale, almost translucent shade. His movements grew languid, his breath shallow and uneven. Those closest to him, whether out of loyalty or fear, noticed how Caligula's eyes no longer focused with the sharpness of command. Instead, they flickered with an unsettling vacancy, like windows to a mind increasingly adrift. It was a time when madness and mortality intertwined, blurring the distinction between sovereign and shadow. Caligula's daily routine became a performance layered with tragic absurdity. Rising late, he would don his imperial garments with a trembling hand, then descend from his chambers into the throne room where senators awaited, their faces masks of ingrained caution. These meetings, meant for governance, often dissolved into spectacles, where the emperor's caprices were law and reason was a distant memory. Senators sat in uneasy silence as Caligula alternated between moments of eerie calm and sudden fits of rage, descending unpredictably like a tempest, striking without warning. One of the most telling signs of his deterioration was the gradual subsumption of reality by delusion. The emperor increasingly conflated his image with divinity, but now it was not subtle or triumphant. It was fractured and erratic. At times he would issue proclamations declaring himself as Jupiter incarnate, commanding that sacrifices be made in his name throughout the city. Priests and magistrates obliged, though their compliance was steeped not only in reverence but palpable fear. To resist was unthinkable, yet silence weighed heavily on those who bore witness to what many viewed as a sacrilegious blasphemy. Among his many peculiar behaviors was a renewed fixation on the notion of loyalty, which in his mind became indistinguishable from submission. Caligula's court was filled with a theater of suspicion and control. It was not uncommon for him to summon a group of senators or guards to banquets that ended with secret selections. Some guests would survive, others would vanish without explanation. The uncertainty bred a suffocating tension, making every smile suspect and every glance a possible threat. Loyalty became a fragile currency, constantly tested by fear and unpredictability. At night, the palace became a place of whispers and shadows. Guards reported hearing faint sobbing or the soft cadence of murmured prayers, as if the walls themselves tried to resist the overwhelming darkness settling inside. Rumors circulated of secret chambers where the emperor met with a select few, those who dared or were compelled to listen to his fragmented thoughts. These sessions, if they can be called so, were marked by moments of gentleness swiftly crushed by bursts of fury. It is said that in these moments Caligula's grip on reality loosened completely, revealing the depths of a mind torn apart by grief, paranoia, and isolation. Perhaps most tragically symbolic of this downward spiral was the fate of Drusilla, his beloved sister. Though details remain shrouded in uncertainty, most sources agree that her death struck a fatal blow to Caligula's fragile psyche. Drusilla had been a steady presence in his turbulent world, a companion and confidant amid a court of deceit and danger. Her loss seemed to unmoor him entirely. In the aftermath, the emperor's demeanor shifted from erratic to desolate, his actions emboldened by desperation and despair. Some accounts speak of Caligula ordering extravagant and disturbing funerary rites, blending imperial ceremony with his own deluded claims of divine kinship. This profound grief further destabilized an already frayed court. The shadow Drusilla left behind became an oppressive presence in the palace, a reminder of lost reason and a lingering threat in the form of a ruler untethered from both love and sanity. Courtiers who might have dared approach Caligula found only a hollow shell, and those who once sought favor from the emperor now kept their distance, preferring silence to attention, concealment to revelation. As the public spectacle faded, Caligula turned inward, retreating from the functions of state even as his commands grew more erratic and severe. While Rome continued to function on the surface, the machinery of governance slowed to a near halt. Debts accumulated, provincial governors received contradictory orders, and the once mighty Senate found itself sidelined, reduced to spectators in a drama of madness. Their frustration blossomed into fear, a fear sharpened by the gruesome realities of what it meant to cross the emperor's will. Among the many acts that terrified the city, the executions carried out during these final days stand out with grim detail. No official trials, no formal accusations, simply the decree of an emperor consumed by distrust and rage. Senators, officers, even slaves disappeared under cloak of night, their fates known only to those charged with carrying out the grim orders. The reasons were often petty or unfathomable, adding to a climate of dread where survival itself seemed arbitrary. Each vanishing sent ripples of terror through the court, fracturing loyalties and extinguishing hope. The Praetorian Guard, charged with protecting the emperor, became increasingly conflicted. Their loyalty, once fierce and unshakable, struggled against the growing realization that the man they guarded was no longer a leader, but a peril. Mutters of conspiracy stirred among them, shadows shifting in dark corridors as plans took shape, quietly but resolutely. For the guards, the question was no longer if, but when the madness would end, and who would be willing to wield the deadly hand of change. Behind closed doors, this scheming took form. The conspirators, some senators, some guardsmen, spoke of duty and salvation, of rescuing Rome from the tyranny of a mad god among men. Their alliance was fragile, forged from fear, but sustained by a shared vision of a Rome reclaimed from chaos. In their whispers, the city that had once celebrated Caligula's ascendancy prepared to bid farewell to a reign marked by terror and disarray. On the cusp of this irreversible turning point, Caligula remained seemingly unaware of the storm approaching. His days drifted in a haze of grandiosity and despair, his nights restless and filled with shadowed visions. The palace, once a beacon of imperial might, had become, in essence, a prison, a gilded cage where madness reigned unchecked until fate intervened. As the sun prepared to rise on what would become the emperor's final day, an eerie calm settled over Rome. The city's breath hung suspended, the distant murmur of the Tiber blending with the faint rustle of olive trees in the breeze. In these quiet moments before history's verdict, one could almost feel the delicate threads of an empire strained taut by the weight of a shattered mind. And so we pause here, on the edge of the decisive dawn where conspirators move into place, and the final act in this tragic meditation on power and madness draws near. When we return, we will gently step across the threshold of that fateful morning, witnessing the moment where the horror of imperial excess meets the grim necessity of justice. Sleep now, as the shadows of ancient Rome deepen softly around you. When you are ready, we will continue together, tracing the final fateful steps of Emperor Caligula's terrifying decline, a chapter carved forever into the marble of history. In the deepest hours following the whispers of conspiracy, the atmosphere within Rome thickened with a quiet dread, as if the city itself was holding its breath in anticipation of the inevitable. The final days of Emperor Caligula's reign were marked by an unnerving stillness that masked the storm gathering swiftly beneath the surface. The palace, a once vibrant heart of Roman power and intrigue, resembled a fragile vessel cracked by years of madness and terror, awaiting the moment it would finally rupture. Caligula, now a shadow of the once charismatic leader who had captured the imagination of Rome, moved through his daily routine with a lethargy that veiled a mind teetering on the edge of collapse. His physical decline mirrored the chaos of his spirit. The emperor's gaunt features, sunken eyes and tremulous hands belying the ferocity of his commands, painted a haunting picture of a man imprisoned by his own unraveling psyche. Despite his apparent fragility, Caligula remained terrifyingly unpredictable. His decrees, the laws that shaped life across the empire, became exercises in cruelty and caprice. Senators found themselves summoned not to deliberate on matters of governance, but to swallow humiliation or face sudden death. The court was rife with fear. Each smile scrutinized, each whisper suspect. The atmosphere resembled a fragile glass sculpture, dazzling yet perilously close to shattering. One chilling tale from this period recounts a banquet ordered by the emperor, inviting select senators and officials. The evening's purpose was a cruel game of fate. Midway through the meal, Caligula reportedly designated some attendees for execution by mere whim. Those marked for survival were left trembling, their relief hollow, knowing how easily fortune might turn against them next time. Such episodes exemplify the theater of terror Caligula had become, a ruler whose rule was less about justice and more about instilling dread as a form of control. While the emperor's madness consumed those in his immediate circle, the tremors spread further. The empire's administration, once efficient and proud, buckled beneath the contradictory edicts and unresolved conflicts. Governors in distant provinces received mixed orders, leading to confusion that imperiled Rome's fragile stability. Citizens, witnessing the extravagance and violence spilling from the palace, found little solace in their daily lives. The public celebrations and religious ceremonies had transformed into grotesque spectacles, glorifying the emperor's delusions of divinity rather than the gods of their tradition. Among the last sparks of Caligula's former affections was his relationship with his sister Drusilla. In earlier years, her presence had been a rare, steadying influence amidst the turbulence of court life. Yet in these dreadful days, her death, some say due to illness, others whisper of something darker, cut deeply into the emperor's fragile mind. The grief was profound and unmoored him even further from reality. Some sources suggest that this loss propelled Caligula's descent from erratic to desolate, his embrace of cruelty intensifying as loneliness encased his heart. In the aftermath of Drusilla's passing, Caligula ordered grandiose and unsettling funerary rites, an eerie blend of imperial splendor and his own delusions about divinity and bloodline. His grief was expressed through ceremonies meant less for mourning than for reinforcing his imagined godhood, entwining sacred rituals with self-aggrandizement. Such displays only deepened the estrangement felt by those who once dared approach him with reverence, now recoiling in fear and sorrow. The personal devastation rippled through his inner circle. Caesonia, Caligula's wife, stood as a fragile figure amid the growing chaos, a woman tasked with navigating the perilous corridors of madness while sheltering their infant daughter. Though distant from the public eye, she was not untouched by the dread enveloping the palace. Her cautious whispers and quiet presence barely concealed the weight of a future shadowed by the emperor's demise. As the emperor withdrew further into himself, the Senate found its patience worn thin. Once hopeful for a renewed Rome, many senators now clandestinely contemplated an end to the nightmare. The balance between submission and revolt teetered precariously. The fear that the Praetorian Guard, once loyal guardians, might abandon their posts only fueled whispers of rebellion. Yet these fears mingled with the memory of ruthless reprisals, keeping open rebellion at bay. Within the guarded shadows of the Palatine Hill, conspiracies coalesced with chilling resolve. A small cadre of senators and disillusioned guardsmen crafted a careful plan, born not from personal ambition alone, but from a desperate conviction that Rome could not endure the emperor's madness. Their goal was clear, their methods secret. They believed that by ending Caligula's reign, they would restore balance, perhaps even salvation, for an empire teetering on collapse. As the fateful day approached, Caligula remained disturbingly detached from these murmurs that swirled invisibly around him. His time was consumed by fits of grandiosity mingled with despondency, his public appearances fewer, yet ever more unpredictable. His proclamations, now laced with desperation, claimed that his reign was eternal, a kingdom beyond mortality. Yet those words rang hollow against the heavy silence brewing in Rome's halls. In these final hours, the emperor's palace was a microcosm of the crumbling empire, a place of whispered fears, darkened corridors, and lingering shadows. Guards exchanged furtive glances, servants moved with quiet tension, and courtiers waited in tense anticipation. The air was thick with the electric charge of impending fate, as if the stones themselves bore witness to the end of an era. And here, in this twilight moment, the threads of this tragic tapestry wound taut, poised to unravel. Caligula's story, an agonizing journey from promising youth to tyrannical madness, from vibrant glory to ghostly isolation, was on the verge of its haunting conclusion. The delicate balance between imperial might and human frailty had shattered, leaving a silence heavy with the echoes of cruelty and despair. In the next chapter, we will step softly into the unfolding of that fateful morning. There, behind the towering pillars and gilded doors, the conspirators will move decisively, forever altering the course of Roman history. The final act in the tragic saga of Emperor Caligula awaits, a moment where power, madness, and destiny collide in a somber symphony of violence and liberation. For now, rest gently as the shadows deepen and the city sleeps under a heavy sky. When you are ready, we will continue together into those closing moments, tracing the last footsteps of a ruler consumed by his own darkness and the quiet, resolute hands that ended his reign. In the final days of Emperor Caligula's reign, Rome was enveloped in an unsettling stillness, a quiet so dense it seemed to press upon the hearts of all who dwelled within the city's ancient walls. The air was thick with anticipation, but not of joyful expectation. Instead, it carried the weight of dread, a collective awareness that the empire's bright but twisted star was about to extinguish. Caligula himself, once the embodiment of youthful promise and imperial glory, had become a specter, a man trapped within the confines of his own unraveling mind and the gilded cage of power that no longer granted him peace. Physically diminished, the emperor moved with a frailness that belied the immense authority he still wielded. His skin, once flushed with health, had faded to a pallid hue, stretched tight over bones that seemed almost fragile. The eyes that once sparkled with a mischievous charm now flickered between vacant detachment and sudden, piercing glances that unnerved even his most loyal attendants. Those closest to him spoke in hushed tones of a man haunted, as if shadows clung to him like a second skin, obscuring the remnants of the vibrant leader Rome had once adored. Despite his feeble appearance, Caligula's will remained ironclad, yet twisted by the haze of paranoia and delusions. His daily proclamations did not ease but exacerbated the fear that gripped the capital. He commanded rituals that blurred the sacred and profane, insisting on sacrifices made in his name with the same reverence once reserved only for Jupiter. Statues of the emperor rose with vainglorious fervor, their marble faces cold and unyielding, reminders carved in stone of the dangerous vanity that had come to define his rule. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was thick with tension and uncertainty. Senators, their masks of composure barely concealing their terror, navigated a labyrinth of imperial whims, knowing that one misstep, even an unintentional glance, could seal their fates. Caligula's cruelty was no longer merely capricious. It was systematic, a tool wielded to break spirits and ensure that obedience was born not of respect, but of fear. The palace halls echoed with whispers, some desperate, others resigned, as men speculated quietly on who might vanish next into the night's shadow without a trace or warning. Among the most disturbing facets of the emperor's spiral was his fixation on loyalty, not as a reciprocal bond, but as a mechanism of absolute domination. Numerous stories tell of banquets turned cruel gambits, where guests dined in uneasy silence, acutely aware that survival might be a matter of fortune rather than merit. In these grim courts, hospitality was a pretense, masking a lethal game where favor was fragile and caprice ruled above law. Interwoven with the political terror was the personal tragedy that further darkened Caligula's final days. His sister Drusilla, who had once been a nurturing figure within the turbulent court, died unexpectedly. Whether from illness or a fate more sinister remains conjecture, but her passing left an indelible scar on the emperor's psyche. Those who observed him after her death found that whatever emotional anchor he had maintained was now shattered, and in its place rose a more desperate and unhinged aspect of his personality. His grief, rather than softening him, deepened the chasm between Caligula and reason. He ordered lavish, unsettling funerary rites that fused imperial pomp with notions of divine kinship, rituals that bewildered and unsettled those who served the court. Some chroniclers note how this loss seemed to drive the emperor toward increasingly erratic and dangerous behavior, reflecting a descent where sorrow merged with madness to lethal effect. At the same time, his wife Caesonia, a figure cloaked in both devotion and fear, inhabited a precarious existence. Shielding their infant daughter from the turbulent court, she remained close to the emperor's side, perhaps the last living link to his waning humanity. Yet even her presence could not stem the growing tide of collapse that engulfed the palace and, by extension, the empire itself. The Senate, once eager to celebrate a promising new reign, now convened behind guarded faces filled with anxiety and barely concealed despair. With each cruel edict and arbitrary execution, their hope for stability eroded, replaced by a chilling realization that survival, rather than governance, was paramount. Delicate alliances shifted like shadows, and whispered plots began to weave their way through the marble corridors of power. The Praetorian Guard, whose duty was to protect the emperor and maintain order, found their loyalty increasingly tested, caught between terror of their charge and a mounting sense of duty to Rome itself. Within these secretive conspiracies, a stark determination took root, a resolve to end the emperor's reign before his madness irrevocably shattered the heart of the empire. The assassins were few but resolute, bound by a shared conviction that the cost of inaction was far greater than the peril of rebellion. While their methods were clandestine and their plans fragile, the sense of desperation that guided them was profound, born from years of witnessing the grotesque spectacle that Caligula's rule had become. Meanwhile, the city beyond the palace walls carried on with a precarious normalcy, As if unwilling or unable to confront the tempest gathering at its core, the people of Rome endured the lavish but hollow festivals, the grotesque parodies of religious ceremonies, and the draining extravagances which emptied the treasury, even as fear and uncertainty crept into every corner of public life. Public opinion, once hopeful and celebratory, had turned to wary silence, the kind born of survival rather than faith. And so, as the sun prepared to rise on what history would remember as the final day of Caligula's reign, an eerie calm settled over the city. The emperor, isolated in his chambers, remained entangled in a web of grandiosity and despair, his last illusions of divinity clashing with the stark realities closing in around him. The palace, a monument to power now crumbling from within, waited silently for the decisive moment when fate and fear would converge. In these fragile final hours, the tension was palpable. Guards moved with measured steps, conspirators concealed their resolve behind composed faces, and the city itself seemed to draw a collective breath. The chapter of Caligula's reign, marked by brilliance, depravity, and madness, was poised on a knife's edge, awaiting the unraveling that would forever change the course of Roman history. As we prepare to step gently into that fateful dawn, when secret hands would bring an end to a terrifying saga of power and delusion, know that this story is more than the tale of one man's downfall. It is a somber meditation on the dangers of unchecked authority, the fragility of human reason, and the quiet resilience of those who dare to restore balance in the face of chaos. When you are ready, we will continue our journey together into the heart of the imperial palace on that final morning. There we will witness the silent movements, the whispered words, and the grave consequences that marked the end of Emperor Caligula's horrific final days. Sleep softly now, with the muted echoes of ancient Rome fading gently into the quiet night. And when you awaken, we will step once more into history's shadowed depths, following the course of an empire reborn from the fracture of a tyrant's fall. In the faint early light of that final morning, the city of Rome lay hushed beneath a sky yet heavy with the chill of dawn. The morning air, still thick with the residue of night, seemed almost charged with a tension far heavier than the fragile silence suggested. Inside the precincts of the Palatine Hill, the heart of imperial power beat its last steady pulse, even as it teetered on the brink of collapse. The long, horrific reign of Emperor Caligula was drawing to a close, quietly, inexorably, and with a darkness waiting to spill forth. Caligula himself, worn and hollowed by months of relentless mental and physical decline, was beginning his day much as he had the countless days before, isolated within the vast and stifling chambers of his palace, surrounded by marble and gold that now seemed only to mock him. His once vibrant world had shrunk to shadows and whispers, and his presence had become little more than a fragile echo of the bright shadow he had once cast over Rome. Those who still served him moved silently, their steps cautious and measured, as if the slightest disturbance might shatter the uneasy calm hanging over the empire. The emperor's gaunt figure appeared briefly in the hallway, his eyes deep pools of vacant despair, reflecting a mind caught somewhere between the fleeting embers of clarity and the abyss of madness. His breath was shallow, uneven, but his will remained unnervingly unbroken, even if twisted beyond recognition. Behind the polished surfaces of the palace, the wheels of conspiracy had already turned into motion. A furtive alliance of senators and disillusioned Praetorian guardsmen had resolved that this was the moment, a cruel and desperate necessity to restore Rome from the nightmare that Caligula's rule had become. Their plan was precise but perilous, cloaked in secrecy and carried out with a quiet determination born of exhaustion and fear. The conspirators gathered in the labyrinthine corridors and hidden chambers of the palace, voices hushed but resolute. They spoke in tones that blended pragmatic urgency with a deep, weary sorrow for the course their city had taken. It was not hatred that drove them, but a somber hope for an end that might, however briefly, bring peace. Among them were those who had once admired the emperor's youthful promise, those who had thrived in his court's dangerous games, and those who had lost everything to his caprice. As the hour approached, the atmosphere grew charged with a silent tension. The usual sounds of the morning, the stirring of servants, the clatter of footsteps, the faint murmur of distant senators arriving, faded beneath the weight of anticipation. The walls that bore witness to decades of imperial dramas now waited, as if holding their breath, for a scene unlike any before. In the throne room, Caligula sat draped in his imperial purple, a shadow upon the gilded seat of power. His eyes roamed over the figures who attended him, faces tight with fear and forced loyalty, hearts pounding beneath heavy cloaks of dread. To any casual observer, the scene might have seemed a continuation of the volatile court that Caligula had ruled with a mixture of cruelty and caprice. Yet beneath the surface lay the fragile web of treachery ready to snap. It was in this charged silence that the fatal moment unfolded. The assassins, cloaked in the guise of guards and courtiers, moved swiftly and without hesitation. The emperor, caught between paranoia and disbelief, was overwhelmed, his final breaths a mixture of shock, rage, and something indistinct, nearly human in their terror. In those last moments, the crumbling facade of divine majesty shattered completely, revealing a man undone by his own excesses and haunted by a descent none could halt. The killing itself was brutal, yet carried out with the cold precision of those who saw it as a necessary act of salvation. The Praetorian prefect Cassius Chaerea, a figure who had once symbolized loyal service to the emperor, took the lead, his blade severing the thread of Caligula's reign, and with it, the twisted echo of a power corrupted beyond repair. The palace erupted into chaos, but it was a madness different from the emperor's, a frantic scramble between those loyal to the fallen ruler and those who sought to restore order. News of Caligula's death spread swiftly, carried by breathless whispers and anxious messengers through the marble halls and crowded streets of Rome. For many, it was a moment of trembling relief, a shattering of the spell that had gripped their city in fear. Yet beneath their shouts of joy, a profound uncertainty settled, for the empire now faced the daunting question of what might come next. The immediate aftermath was a swirl of political maneuvering and cautious hope. The new emperor, Claudius, Caligula's uncle, was hastily installed, signaling a return to a semblance of stability. Yet the scars of Caligula's reign, the fear he sowed, the families he destroyed, the fragile trust he shattered, remained etched deeply into the fabric of Roman life. As courtiers and citizens alike sought to understand the depths of what had transpired, accounts of the emperor's final days emerged, painted in vivid yet softened detail that spoke of a man trapped by his own mind, a victim as much as a perpetrator of horror. The lavish excesses, the brutal caprices, the blasphemous delusions, all were laid bare, as if the collective memory of Rome sought to purge itself through remembrance. And amidst this reckoning, the personal tragedies were not forgotten. The death of Drusilla, the loss of trust within the imperial family, the fragility of Caesonia and the newborn child, these human elements offered a somber counterpoint to the grandeur and violence. They were reminders that behind the myths of emperors and gods were lives marked by loss, fear, and fleeting moments of tenderness. The fall of Caligula stands as a testament, a chilling narrative that power, unchecked and intertwined with madness, can spiral into destruction, not only for those who wield it, but for all who live under its shadow. Yet it also reveals the resilience of a society that, even after suffering profound trauma, sought to heal, rebuild, and move forward. As we leave behind these final, harrowing days, it is with the recognition that history is as much about the fragile human souls caught within it as it is about the grand events that shape empires. The story of Caligula's end is a solemn reflection on that vulnerability, a whisper from antiquity that warns and consoles with equal weight. When you are ready, we will continue our journey into the repercussions of this fateful moment. In the next chapter, we will explore the immediate fallout of Caligula's assassination, the shifting power dynamics, the fragile peace, and the enduring echoes of a reign whose shadow stretched far beyond its bloody conclusion. For now, rest gently, cradled by the quiet rhythms of a night that stretches timeless and calm over ancient Rome. When you awaken, we will walk once more through the marble corridors of history, tracing the paths by which an empire sought to reclaim its soul after the horrors of imperial madness. In the faint light filtering through the high windows of the imperial palace, the atmosphere was thick with an unsettling silence, one more profound than the stillness of night. Rome itself seemed to hold its breath, the daily clamor muted as if the city sensed the approaching end to an age brimming with dread and despair. Emperor Caligula, once lauded as a promising beacon of renewed vitality for the empire, had become a shadow wrapped in frenzied delusions and creeping madness, his every movement attended by terror and sorrow. That morning, as the imperial chambers slowly awakened, the emperor remained secluded within the ornate but suffocating walls of his quarters. To those who glimpsed his figure, he appeared diminished, a fragile remnant of the man who had seized power with fire and fanfare. His body, gaunt and trembling, betrayed the relentless strain that consumed him. His eyes, once sharp and commanding, flickered with an erratic intensity that spoke of torment locked deep within. Yet, even in this fragile state, Caligula's will held a twisted iron grip, bending those around him to his fluctuating desires and fears. The court moved like a living shadowland. Courtiers whispered in hushed tones, their faces etched with dread. Each step through the palace halls was cautious, as if the very stones were listening, and the walls might reveal secrets best kept hidden. Senators who once vied openly for imperial favor now sat silently in their appointed seats, their expressions masks of restraint, knowing that a single miscalculation could hasten their end. For them, the line between survival and annihilation had become perilously thin. Among the quiet desperation was the recurring specter of the emperor's paranoia. Caligula cast suspicion like a heavy shroud across every interaction. Friends became foes, allies were scrutinized, and deeds, no matter how loyal, were questioned with venomous doubt. It was said that even the Praetorian guards, stalwart protectors bound by duty and fear, found their resolve tested by the unpredictability of the man they were sworn to defend. Caligula's infamous fixation on his horse, incitatus, had taken on a new, darker tone. No longer a mere symbol of mockery, the lavish care bestowed upon the creature seemed emblematic of imperial derangement, an unsettling testament to the emperor's contempt for the structures that once upheld Rome's power. Marble stables, jeweled trappings, and ivory furnishings spoke less of extravagance and more of a mind unraveling at the seams. The notion, whispered among frightened courtiers, that incitatus might be elevated to consul was not merely an eccentric fantasy, but a deliberate psychological weapon against a Senate already trembling beneath the weight of tyranny. Within the palace, the shadow of Drusilla, Caligula's sister and rumored confidant, lingered heavily. Her death, sudden and shrouded in mystery, was a wound that rent the fragile fabric of the emperor's mind. Where once her presence had offered comfort or perhaps unsettling companionship, now only an aching void remained. Some chroniclers suggest that this profound loss tore open a fissure too wide for Caligula's fractured psyche to mend, plunging him into depths of despair that fueled the further descent into cruel and erratic behavior. The imperial ceremonies that followed her passing were unlike any before. Grandeur steeped in sorrow and madness intertwined. Caligula, declaring divine kinship with his sister, orchestrated rites that blurred the lines between mourning and self-worship. The funeral pyres burned bright beneath the night sky, illuminating faces contorted by grief or fear, as the rites themselves became a tragic stage upon which the emperor played out the fracture of his soul. As grief hollowed his heart, Caligula's cruelty sharpened into a weapon aimed indiscriminately. Banquets turned perilous, friendships became gambits of survival, and the simplest gestures were weighed for hidden meaning. Stories survive of invitations extended with smiles masking deadly intent, where guests at lavish feasts might find themselves marked for disappearance in the dead of night. The palace had become not a place of governance but a theater of terror, where every act was a dance with death and every word, a test of endurance. The executions that punctuated these final days were swift and merciless. Accused or not, the condemned were seized under cover of darkness, their fate sealed by a whim steeped in madness. The walls of the palace seemed to breathe with the echo of muffled screams, silent to the world but devastating to those trapped within the suffocating orbit of tyranny. These acts were no longer public dramas meant to reinforce power, but hidden erasures, ghostly vanishings that left only fear's lingering shadow. Caesonia, Caligula's wife, occupied a precarious space within this collapsing world. Shielding their infant daughter from the proliferating darkness was at once her sanctuary and her prison. Though spared the brunt of public spectacle, the tension that embroidered every moment within the palace's confines was as palpable to her as to anyone. Her presence, quiet and measured, was a fragile thread connecting the past promises of imperial hope with the bleak present unraveling around her. The Senate, too, found itself caught in a tightening noose. The chamber, once echoing with debate and ambition, now reverberated with whispered fears and cautious plans. Senators weighed the cost of endurance against the lure of resistance. The memories of brutal reprisal tempered their resolve, yet the growing horror of continued submission bred a quiet desperation. The loyalty that had once underpinned the empire's elite was fraying, replaced by a grim resolve that would soon ignite into deadly action. Meanwhile, within the ranks of the Praetorian Guard, uncertainty bloomed into silent conspiracy. These men, the emperor's sworn protectors, found in their hearts a growing conflict, duty to Rome, and fear of the ruler they now guarded. Whispers passed like currents beneath the surface, plans made in shadows, oaths exchanged in silence, steeling themselves to a grim resolve. The time may have come not only to serve, but to intervene. As the final days waned, Caligula's isolation became absolute. The man who once strode the Palatine Hill with laughter and imperial pride now lingered at the edge of remembrance, his commands growing less coherent, his appearances fleeting and frail. His mind, besieged by grief and delusion, turned increasingly inward, lost in a labyrinth of fractured identity and divine pretension. To those around him, his presence was like an echo fading into silence, a ghost trapped within the remnants of power. In the final hours, the palace held its breath. Every whisper carried the weight of impending change. Every shadow might conceal conspirators moving closer to their fateful task. The city outside continued its measured rhythm, unaware or unwilling to confront the shifting tides within its heart. Rome, poised between the decay of imperial madness and the promise of restoration, awaited the moment when history would pivot. It was in this quiet, somber calm that the intricate threads of conspiracy wound tighter. The assassins, men united by fear, regret, and a desperate hope for salvation, prepared themselves to sever the tyrant's reign. Their plan, wrought from months of clandestine discourse and silent accord, was no mere act of rebellion, but a somber duty, a painful breaking of chains for a city starved of peace. As dawn's pale light began to comb the palatial marble, Caligula sat unaware, the crown's weight heavier than ever upon his fading spirit. The stage was set for the tragic finale, where power, madness, and fate would collide amid stone and shadow. And so, as we gather at the threshold of that day, the final chapter of Caligula's terrifying descent is ready to unfold. When we return, we will step into the palace corridors where whispered words became deeds, and history was forever changed by the quiet stroke of blades in the morning light. Rest now, under the tranquil shroud of night, as the echoes of ancient Rome grow soft. When you awaken, we will continue our journey together, into the heart of the imperial palace on that last day, tracing the closing footsteps of a reign that forever altered the course of an empire. In the fragile gray light of dawn, the city of Rome lay quietly beneath an uneasy sky, as though holding its breath in anticipation of the day to come. The Palatine Hill, imperial heart of the empire, stood solemn, its marble pillars and lofty arches steeped in a silence that trembled with tension. Within the gilded confines of the palace, the last hours of Emperor Caligula's reign unfolded with a somber gravity, veiled beneath the surface of routine morning rituals. Caligula, gaunt and pale, moved slowly through his chambers, a shadow of the man who had once captivated Rome with youthful vigor and chaotic flamboyance. His eyes, once bright and unpredictable, now flickered with a hollow intensity, revealing how deeply his mind was trapped between fragile lucidity and consuming delusion. Cloaked in his purple robes, he sat intermittently on his throne, his presence barely commanding the room but still shrouded in the trappings of absolute power. Around him, the court stirred with a peculiar energy, one that blended fear, anticipation, and quiet resolve. Senators and guards, courtiers and slaves moved carefully, their footsteps light, their whispers hushed. For many, the reign of terror that had gripped the empire was nearing its fragile end. Though the exact hour remained cloaked in uncertainty, the emperor's caprice and cruelty had carved deep scars into Rome's fabric, and the air itself seemed laden with the weight of impending reckoning. Among those within the palace walls, the seeds of conspiracy had long since taken root. What began as mere murmurs had grown into a firm, resolute plan, one fueled by a collective desperation to release Rome from the shadow of madness. Senators, once cowed into silence, and members of the Praetorian Guard, sworn to protect yet haunted by fear, had bound themselves together in secret, united by a fragile hope. They moved now with quiet determination, aware of the chilling dangers that awaited them should their plot be unveiled. The palace, a place once vibrant with music and laughter, seemed haunted now by muted echoes, the ghost of a grandeur dissolved in whispers and fear. The corridors, lined with gilded statues and frescoes of ancient gods, felt to many like the edges of a vast prison where madness had grown unchecked. Amid the tense stillness, the legend of Caligula's extravagances hung like a dark cloud. The opulent stables of Incitatus, the purples and jewels, and the macabre theater in which human lives had been repeatedly sacrificed to whim and paranoia. The figure of Drusilla, the emperor's sister, lingered in memory like a fading light. Her unexpected death during these final days had struck Caligula's already fragile psyche with devastating force. Observers noted his grief transformed from sorrow into a desperate fury, pushing him further into isolation and erratic cruelty. That loss seemed to unravel what little tether he had left to reality, unraveling the fragile veneer of imperial dignity beneath which madness festered. In the wake of Drusilla's passing, the ceremonies arranged by Caligula blurred the lines between imperial ritual and personal obsession. Funeral pyres burned high against the night, lit by torches that cast strange shadows on faces wrought with fear or fascination. These grand displays were not only a tribute, but also a grim assertion of the emperor's delusions, of divine bloodlines, and a cosmic right to rule that dissolved into a haunting plea to the gods, or perhaps to fate itself. Within the palace, the atmosphere thickened with a suffocating tension. Courtiers eyed each other warily, knowing that the capricious will of the emperor could shift with terrifying swiftness. Banquets, once gatherings of power and celebration, had degenerated into deadly games. Guests sat uneasy, their laughter forced, as the knowledge that some might be marked for death turned the morning meal into a tableau of silent dread. Stories survive of these cruel entertainments, where Caligula devised spectacles that blurred the line between mercy and cruelty. Senators, generals, and even palace servants found themselves pawns in a cruel performance where favor was as fleeting as shadow. This cultivated atmosphere of uncertainty fractured alliances and eroded any sense of trust, leaving a court torn apart by fear and suspicion. As each day faded into night, the executions multiplied. No longer public displays intended to instill order or obedience, these killings took on a secretive, almost spectral character. Men disappeared quietly, taken in the darkness with little explanation or trial. The walls of the palace echoed faintly with muffled cries, silenced swiftly and unseen, their victims vanishing like ghosts into the depths of madness that had consumed the empire. Even the Praetorian Guard, once unyielding in their protection of the emperor, found their loyalty strained to breaking. Whispers of mutiny and assassination plans coursed beneath their disciplined exteriors. These men, bound by oaths and honor, confronted the impossible choice between duty and salvation. Their conflicted hearts weighed heavily, their hands alternating between drawing swords in defense and plotting to end the reign of chaos for the good of Rome. Among the few constants amid the wreckage was the figure of Caesonia, Caligula's wife, a woman caught in the suffocating storm of palace intrigue and fear. Shielding their tender infant daughter, she embodied a fragile hope amidst decay. Her presence was a bittersweet reminder of love and vulnerability clinging to the edges of madness, a humanizing thread in the tapestry of terror that defined the twilight of the emperor's rule. Outside the palace walls, Rome continued its daily rhythms, though a shadow hung over the city. The streets echoed with a nervous energy. Public celebrations, once inspiring unity, became hollow parodies of grandeur. The temples, now dotted with statues dedicated to the emperor himself, stood as silent witnesses to his blasphemy. Moments of devotion turned into reminders of a fractured faith. The Senate, weary and wary, gathered behind guarded doors. Their debates gave way to whispered plans and cautious steps toward a future uncertain. Some few dared to hope that this reign of terror might soon be ended by their own hands. They calculated the risks, the wrath of the Praetorian Guard, the unknown consequences of regicide, and the fragile promise of peace that might follow. As the final day approached, the palace held its breath in quiet anticipation. The empire, vast and ancient, balanced delicately on the edge of a knife. The intricate threads of conspiracy were pulled taut, poised to unravel the nightmare woven by years of cruelty and madness. The moment to confront history itself was at hand. Within the dim chambers, Caligula remained isolated, his mind a kaleidoscope fractured by grief, paranoia, and delirium. His proclamations grew more desperate, his confidence a flickering candle struggling against an encroaching darkness. To some, he was a tragic figure, to others, a monstrous tyrant. Yet in those final hours, beneath the veils of madness and fear, he was simply a man bound by the weight of his own making. And so, As we stand on the threshold of that fateful morning, the story of Caligula's life draws close to its haunting conclusion. The conspirators close ranks, the city waits in fragile silence, and the empire braces for a moment that will echo through the centuries. When next we meet, we will quietly follow the steps that led to the emperor's final breath, the swift and irrevocable fall of a ruler consumed by his own darkness. Together we will witness how the fragile balance between power and madness tipped irrevocably, and how Rome began the long, slow journey from terror toward an uncertain dawn. Rest now in the gentle quiet of the night, cradled by the soft shadows of ancient history. When you are ready, we will continue our journey into the final, shattering moments of Emperor Caligula's reign. In the fragile quiet of dawn, Rome's great city remained strangely still, as though the very stones of the Palatine Hill whispered of the approaching fate. Within the emperor's palace, beneath the cold gaze of marble statues and the weight of gilded ceilings, the final hours of Caligula's life played out, a slow unraveling wreathed in shadows and trembling whispers. Caligula, the once vibrant and unpredictable ruler, sat shrouded in his purple robes, the rich fabric now a fragile cocoon for a man diminished by illness, grief, and madness. His gaunt face bore the marks of relentless torment, his eyes flickering between vacant detachment and the sudden flare of wild intensity that unsettled even the most hardened courtiers. The weight of power, which had once elevated him above all others, now seemed to crush him beneath its unbearable pressure. His mind drifted restlessly, clouded with delusions of grandeur and haunted by loss. The death of his beloved sister Drusilla had left a void impossible to fill, a rift in his fractured psyche that swallowed whatever remnants of reason remained. Some whispered that, in his grief, he sought to entwine himself eternally with her memory through macabre and extravagant rituals, blending imperial funeral rites with personal fantasy. The night fires that burned in her honor cast flickering shadows over the palace, reflecting a solemn tragedy as much as a spectacle of madness. Amid this somber twilight, the court moved cautiously, enmeshed in a tense dance of fear and anticipation. Senators, once bold and brazen, now wore expressions of carefully veiled dread. Their loyalty had long since become an outward performance, masking the growing hunger for an end to the tyranny they suffered. Around them, the Praetorian guards cast furtive glances, their hands hovering near hilts, their whispered conspiracies weaving silently through marble halls and shadowed corridors. Caligula's latest proclamations deepened the gulf between sovereign and subjects. His zeal for self-deification had burst into a grotesque flourish. Temples erected in his honor, sacrifices imposed in his name, and monuments rivaling those of the gods themselves. To defy such blasphemy was unthinkable, yet his demands only nourished resentment and despair. For many, the emperor had become less man, more a spectral tyrant trapped in a haunting pantomime of power. In these final days, Caligula's cruelty became merciless and inscrutable. Banquets, once grand affairs of state, had transformed into grim stages where survival hung on a thread. Guests dined under the shadow of silent threats. Some dined for life, others unknowingly tasted their last meal. The brutal game of chance he played to punish, humiliate, or kill eroded the bonds of trust so crucial to any court's survival. Behind every polite smile lurked suspicion. Behind every whispered word, fear. The secret executions added a chilling undertone to the palace's oppressive atmosphere. Men and women who had once held positions of power, command, or favor faded in the night without trial, their disappearances wreathed in silence and dread. These acts were not publicly declared spectacles but hidden erasures, swift and final, severing ties, extinguishing voices, and deepening the terror that gripped all who remained. Even the Praetorian Guard, historically unwavering in their fidelity to the emperor, struggled under the unbearable burden of uncertainty and horror. The men tasked with securing Caligula's safety increasingly found themselves torn between duty and conscience. Rumors of mutiny and conspiracy spun through their ranks, silent oaths taken beneath flickering torchlight, preparing the path for a decisive reckoning. As the fateful day crept closer, the palace's air grew taut with anticipation. Courtiers concealed their resolve behind practiced masks. Conspirators whispered last plans while eyes darted nervously down darkened hallways. Rome itself seemed poised on the cusp of transformation, trembling between the lingering nightmare of imperial madness and the fragile promise of deliverance. Within this crucible of tension, Caligula remained an isolated figure, trapped in the labyrinth of his own collapse. Moments of eerie lucidity slipped between periods of fevered grandiosity and despair. His proclamations now bore a desperate edge, clinging to illusions of eternity in a reign descending into chaos. Beyond the visage of divinity lay a fractured man weighed down by loss and the gnawing dread of a future he could no longer command. His wife, Caesonia, moved quietly in this fractured world, a tenuous link to the man her husband had been. Shielding their infant daughter from the crumbling palace and fractured empire, she represented a fragile hope amid the catastrophe. Yet even her presence was shadowed by fear, the knowledge that the world they inhabited was tilting toward ruin, and that the child's inheritance was one carved in blood and madness. In the early light, the conspirators made their final gestures, the senators who had endured too many harrowing months, the disaffected guardsmen who no longer believed in their charge's divinity, but saw instead a man lost to darkness. Their plan was measured, precise, born from desperation, and a solemn belief that the murder of an emperor was a tragic but necessary sacrifice for Rome's survival. Together, they moved with quiet determination through the palace corridors, shadows slipping past silent sentries, their breaths shallow and hearts heavy. Each step took them closer to the throne room, where the flickering torchlight painted broken reflections on marble walls. Within that chamber Caligula sat, his form diminished, a prisoner to the weight of a crown that had become unbearable. The masks of god and ruler dissolved in the quiet terror of a man facing the twilight of both power and life. His last moments, hurried and violent, brought his reign to an abrupt and bloody end. The echo of the fatal strike shattered the palace's heavy silence, like thunder in a clouded sky. The emperor's turbulent symphony of power and madness concluded with a swift and deadly finality. As the conspirators dispersed into the corridors, the island of fear that had comprised Caligula's world collapsed, leaving behind a void where terror and illusion once reigned. News of the assassination swept through Rome with ripples of shock, relief, and anxious uncertainty. The city awoke from a nightmare, yearning for peace but weighed down by the scars carved deep by years of delusion and cruelty. Officials and citizens alike grappled with the enormity of the event, caught between the promise of new beginnings and the shadow of lingering horrors. Caligula's death marked not only the fall of a ruler but the fracturing of an empire's confidence, a somber reminder of how swiftly the pillars of power could crumble beneath the weight of madness. His legacy remained a haunting paradox, a man who held the world in his hands yet was undone by his own demons, a figure as tragic as he was terrifying. As the sun rose on the days to come, the empire faced the daunting task of healing and rebuilding. The fragile thread of stability was taken up by Claudius, Caligula's uncle, whose ascent offered hope amid uncertainty. Yet the echoes of the emperor's reign, the fear, the cruelty, the broken trust, would reverberate for years, a quiet warning etched into Rome's collective memory. And so, as we close this chapter of desolation and descent, we find a city trembling on the cusp of renewal, hope mingling with the shadows of the past. Caligula's final days serve as a whisper carried through time, reminding us of the peril that lies in unchecked power, untethered reason, and solitary grief. When next we meet, we will explore the aftermath, the fragile peace, the shifting tides of Rome's political landscape, and how an empire sought to reclaim itself after the storm. But for now, rest gently as the echoes of an emperor's downfall fade softly into the quiet night, carrying with them the solemn lessons of history's darker corridors. Sleep softly, and when you are ready, we will continue our journey through the shadows of ancient Rome together. In the fragile light of dawn, as the city of Rome slowly stirred beneath a pale sky, an unsettling quiet hung over the imperial palace. The Palatine Hill, grand and silent, bore witness to shadows shifting unseen among its marble halls and vast chambers. It was in these spaces, once filled with the clamor of imperial authority and celebration, that the final, somber scenes of Caligula's reign would soon unfold. The emperor himself, a spectral figure draped in the purple of dominion, moved through his day with a frail gait and an expression veiled by haunting vacancy. His once vibrant eyes, now flickering with unpredictable intensity, darted across the faces that surrounded him, faces marked by fear, resignation, or the thin veneer of loyalty worn to survive. His physical form had wasted into gauntness, his skin pale, and almost translucent beneath the sheen of sweat that sometimes clung to his brow. Though diminished in strength, his presence remained suffused with an eerie authority, a disturbed monarch bound by illness and madness to a throne that had outgrown him. Around him, the court navigated the treacherous currents of a reign teetering on oblivion. Men and women cloaked in silks and shadows whispered anxiously in the marble corridors, their eyes shifting nervously behind fixed, careful expressions. Senators who had once courted favor now measured each word, each gesture, with the calculus of survival. The Praetorian Guard, outwardly steadfast, hid their growing doubts and whispered conspiracies beneath the surface of disciplined allegiance. A palpable tension weighted the air, threading through every chamber like a slow poison. Within this suffocating atmosphere, Caligula's behaviors oscillated sharply between despondency and fevered delusion. Some moments found him silent, withdrawn into the labyrinth of his flickering mind. Others saw him erupt briefly into sharp commands or cryptic proclamations, as if wrestling invisible foes or conjuring distant visions. The tyrant who once ruled with reckless flamboyance had become a haunted shadow, trapped within the dual torment of supreme power and utter dissolution. The loss of his beloved sister Drusilla in recent weeks had left a wound too deep to heal. Once a rare constant amidst the chaos of court intrigue and imperial caprice, she had provided a semblance of companionship, however fraught and whispered about it might have been. Her sudden demise had shattered this fragile support, sending Caligula spiraling toward an abyss of grief and unmoored frenzy. Tales recount how the emperor ordered lavish funerary rituals, strange and grandiose spectacles that blurred venerable Roman customs with his own haunting visions of divine kinship. Torches blazed through the night, illuminating pyres and statues, casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to dance with the ghosts of lost sanity. In the wake of Drusilla's passing, Caligula's cruelty deepened into something colder, more calculated. The boundary between governance and grotesque spectacle dissolved further. Banquets turned into precarious affairs where survival depended as much on reading the emperor's whims as on political acumen. Courtiers, seated at glittering tables, smiled with forced politeness while silently contemplating whether the meal might be their last. Historical whispers tell of moments when, amid laughter and wine, certain guests would suddenly find themselves marked for execution, sent away under the cover of darkness, their fates known only to the grim shadows of the palace. These secret killings added a spectral terror to the already poisoned air. Men and women of rank and position disappeared with little explanation or trial. No public proclamations followed, no official justice rendered, only muffled cries swallowed by cold stone walls. The removal of perceived enemies became a silent purge, a mechanism to tighten control throbbing with madness and fear. With each vanishing, trust eroded further. Loyalty itself became a fragile currency, traded and tested beneath veils of suspicion. Even the Praetorian Guard, sworn guardians of Rome's ultimate power, found themselves caught in a crucible of divided loyalty. Their hands, once steady in defense, began to tremble under the weight of a ruler consumed by paranoia and instability. Secret conversations passed along barracks corridors, eyes met in cautious accord, and a grim resolve quietly emerged. Though bound by oath, many within their ranks recognized the necessity of intervention, not from ambition, but from a desperate hope to save Rome from the folly of divine madness. Caesonia, Caligula's wife, stood quietly at the edge of this maelstrom, an island of fragile steadiness amid chaos. Shielded by private chambers yet never safe from the ripples of terror, she tended carefully to their infant daughter, the last innocent beam amid waning light. To her, the emperor was at once husband, sovereign, and lost figure trapped in a prison of his own making. Her presence, tender and watchful, offered a reminder that beneath layers of imperial excess and cruelty remained the human heart, beating unevenly but persistently amid the storm. Outside the palace walls, Rome itself continued its rhythms, though under a veil of muted fear. Grand festivals that once celebrated Roman gods and heroes had decayed into hollow displays, honoring an emperor who claimed divinity itself, mocking centuries of tradition. Statues of Caligula had sprung up across the city, their marble faces cold and unyielding, silent monuments not to glory, but to excess and blasphemy. Citizens whispered in bazaars and taverns, their voices lowered by dread, seeing in the emperor's excesses the reflection of a society unraveling. Within the Senate, once a body proud and defiant, A dangerous weariness had set in. Behind closed doors, men who had flourished in political intrigue now plotted quieter schemes born out of desperation. Debate gave way to whisper and caution, as senators balanced the perilous line between obedience and rebellion. The fear of cruel reprisal from the emperor's guard warred with the hope that his reign might soon end. Fragile alliances wove through the chamber like threads on the verge of snapping. Amid these factions, a conspiracy coalesced, not out of lust for power, but out of a shared conviction that Rome's salvation required a violent severing of the past. Senators who had once cringed before Caligula's caprice now girded themselves, meeting in secret chambers beneath the marble city. Praetorian officers, shadowed by their own doubts and fears, lent wary support. Together they mapped a grim path forward, a ritual purification by blade and blood to end the nightmare. As the final morning crept forward, every sense seemed overwhelmed by the weight of impending doom. The time-worn stones of the palace corridors bore silent witness to nervous glances and trembling hands, movements both measured and urgent. Courtiers steeled themselves in quiet anticipation, while servants exchanged furtive whispers, each step echoing a heartbeat towards fate. Caligula, still seated upon his throne, appeared eerily detached, as though caught between realms, human and divine, man and shadow. His proclamations grew more desperate, his grasp on self and sovereignty slipping beneath the tides of madness and sorrow. Moments of fragile clarity flickered briefly before surrendering to the storm within his mind. And then, in those shadowed halls where marble met silence, the conspirators struck. The swift, sharp clash of steel shattered the heavy stillness, and Caligula's turbulent symphony came to a violent and irrevocable end. The emperor's final breaths echoed a tragic mixture of shock, fury, and despair, flickering out beneath the cold gaze of gods and men. The aftermath was immediate and profound. Rome exhaled a breath long held in fear, while the palace erupted into a chaos unlike any before, a clash between lingering loyalists and agents of salvation. The city, caught in the reverberations of a fallen tyrant, awoke to uncertain skies, its future poised delicately between the shadows of the past and the tentative dawn of a new order. Claudius, Caligula's uncle, rose swiftly amid these turbulent tides, his accession heralding the fragile restoration of order. Yet the wounds inflicted by madness and cruelty remained etched deep within Rome's marrow. Families broken, trusts shattered, and memories stained with fear lingered like specters through generations. The final days of Emperor Caligula serve as a haunting testament to the perilous interplay between power and madness. His descent reveals how the brightest crowns can conceal the darkest shadows, and how fragile the balance is between command and dissolution. Yet beneath the layers of horror and excess, the quiet humanity and tragedy of this tale remind us of the vulnerability inherent in all who bear great power. As our journey through these haunting moments nears its close, it is with a solemn reflection on the enduring lessons of history. The fall of a mad emperor is also the story of a people who endured, who witnessed, and who sought to rebuild from the ashes of nightmare. When you are ready, we will continue our voyage together into the aftermath, the delicate and turbulent era that followed Caligula's fall, where the empire grappled with renewal, reckoning, and the fragile hope for peace. For now, let the stillness linger softly around you, the heavy curtains of ancient Rome drawn gently closed as night embraces the city. Rest deeply as the echoes of an emperor's reign fade into history's quiet breath, and prepare to follow the path toward a new dawn. In the fragile, pale light of that final morning, the city of Rome lay subdued under a sky that seemed burdened by the weight of its own history. The Palatine Hill, crowned with its marble palaces and gilded halls, stood silent and expectant. Within those walls, Emperor Caligula moved with a frailty that masked the lingering force of his troubled will. A man caught in the twilight between fading power and imminent oblivion. His physical condition was a stark testament to the torment he had endured. Gaunt and pale, his figure flickered like a candle's flame, tenuous, yet stubborn to be extinguished. His eyes, once alight with spirited, if unsettling energy, now wavered uncertainly as if lost in a labyrinth of haunting memories and fractured thoughts. The heavy garments of imperial purple hung awkwardly upon his diminished frame, the weight of authority seemingly unbearable, pressing down as much on his frail body as it did on the empire he ruled. Those who moved around him did so with a mixture of reverence, fear, and a carefully guarded resolve. Courtiers composed their expressions into masks of calm, while senators sat with quiet resignation, each aware that the fragile veneer of order was seconds away from cracking. Whispers passed like autumn leaves on the wind, subtle currents of fear and hope intertwining. Even the Praetorian Guard, sworn protectors of the emperor's life, carried a tension beneath their disciplined facades, a battle between sworn loyalty and the desperate urge for survival, both their own and that of Rome. Amid the stillness, the ghosts of recent grief lingered most palpably in Caligula's demeanor. The death of his beloved sister Drusilla, herself a figure shrouded in equal parts mystery and devotion, had torn a hole too vast to mend. Where once she had been a rare semblance of companionship amidst a court of treachery and suspicion, now only emptiness remained. The lavish, strange rites Caligula had orchestrated in her honor marked not only a tribute, but also a chilling glimpse into a mind unraveling beneath the strain of unspeakable loss. Those nocturnal ceremonies had transformed the palace grounds into a surreal theater, flames flickering against the darkened sky, statues cast long shadows over faces etched with a blend of awe, fear, and sorrow. Caligula's insistence on integrating sacred funerary traditions with his personal mythos spoke to a desperate attempt to anchor himself amidst slipping reality, clinging to delusions of divine right and eternal bond with the departed. As the hours wore on, the emperor's interactions betrayed the grim fissures in his mind. Moments of sharp, commanding presence broke against stretches of vacant silence or incoherent muttering. Banquets that might once have offered the semblance of imperial civility had decayed into tense performances, where the glances shared between guests spoke louder than words. To dine with Caligula was to navigate a minefield, where favor and doom seemed divided only by whispers and chants. Guests sat, hearts hammering softly beneath silken cloaks, acutely aware that at any moment a glance or a misplaced word could bring the shadow of death. Stories surviving from this period recount how, at certain feasts, some attendees were singled out in silence, marked by the emperor's whim and destined never to leave the table alive. The chilling uncertainty sapped the spirit of the court, replacing loyalty with brittle fear and dissolving the bonds which had sustained Rome's ruling elite for centuries. The night brought with it a darker quiet. Behind closed doors, prisoners were dragged silently away, men and women of status erased without trial or declaration. Their absence was a ghostly presence, an unfolding terror that filled the palace with whispered lamentations and dread. These secret executions, concealed from the public eye, fed the suffocating climate of suspicion and paranoia, fracturing remaining traces of trust and solidarity. No one dared to ask who might be next. Even the Praetorian Guard, those once unwavering pillars of the emperor's strength, now faced a crisis of conscience and courage. Bound by oath to protect the purple-clad sovereign, many had grown disillusioned, wrestling between fear of the tyrant and duty to the city. Secret words passed beneath torchlight in barracks and chambers alike, plans and promises forged in quiet resolve, the conviction that intervention was necessary to safeguard Rome from further desecration grew with each long night. Within this maelstrom stood Caesonia, Caligula's wife, a figure both protected and cornered by the surrounding turbulence. Shielding their infant daughter, she embodied the fragile hope of continuity amidst the empire's crumbling decay. Her presence was a soft thread woven through the harsh tapestry of that day, a reminder of humanity pressed beneath the crushing weight of imperial madness. Beyond the marble and gold, the city carried on, a stage upon which hopes, fears, and whispered prayers mingled. Festivals once rich with religious solemnity had become grotesque displays glorifying the emperor's false godhood, while citizens navigated the streets with lowered heads and wary eyes. The monuments to Rome's gods had lost their meaning, supplanted by pale, cold statues of a man claiming divinity, a blasphemy that gnawed at the soul of the Republic. In these waning hours, the Senate became a crucible of quiet desperation. Men once proud and commanding now sat wrapped in cautious plots, debating survival amid ruin. The boundaries between loyalty and rebellion blurred, as few dared to openly defy the creeping madness, yet many longed for an end. The specter of punishment haunted them still, but the threat of eternal submission loomed darker. The final conspiracy, born in whispered council and shadowed corridor, solidified in resolve and urgency, united by a shared burden, the desire for salvation and the unbearable cost of inaction. Senators and soldiers alike prepared to sever the thread of ruin's weaving. Their plan was both last and necessary. to end the reign of a man consumed by his own darkness and perhaps to offer Rome a chance to heal. As the palace held its breath, the shadows moved quietly, hands trembling but steady, hearts heavy but resolute. The air thickened with expectation, silence layered with the soft footfall of inevitable change. The man who had once dazzled and terrorized now sat alone on his throne, a fragile figure caught between madness and fate. The moment came swiftly, with a tragic suddenness that echoed through the marble halls. Blades flashed in the muted light, a desperate violence born from love of empire and hatred of chaos. Caligula's final breath was both a release and a lament, a man undone by obsession, grief, and unchecked power. In the aftermath, the palace erupted in chaos, the last shreds of terror colliding with the urgency of a new beginning. Rome's citizens, from street to senate, absorbed the shock of an end that was also a beginning. The city exhaled cautiously as the tides of history shifted beneath trembling feet. Claudius, Caligula's uncle, rose swiftly to power amidst the swirling uncertainty, a figure whose ascension heralded hopes of restoration. Yet the shadows cast by Caligula's madness would linger for generations, etched into memory, whispered in legend, a caution to all who wield power. Thus concludes the dreadful symphony of Caligula's final days, a haunting testament to the tenuous balance between authority and sanity, between divine aspiration and human fragility. His legacy, marked by darkness and tragedy, endures as both warning and reflection, that unchecked power can become the architect of its own demise, and that even tyrants are not beyond the reach of fate's quiet hand. As the echoes of this harrowing tale fade slowly into the silence of history, we prepare to turn toward the aftermath, the fragile, difficult path an empire walks when the shadow of madness recedes. When you are ready, we will continue our journey into those uncertain days that followed, exploring how Rome sought to rebuild from ruin, and how power reshaped itself in the wake of destruction. Rest softly now, cradled by the gentle hush of a night that knows all endings and beginnings. When you awaken, we will step once more into the whispers of ancient Rome, tracing the fragile dawn after the fall of an emperor. The next chapter awaits. In the fragile dawn that crept softly over Rome, the city lay cloaked in a heavy and unnatural stillness. The usual bustle of merchants, citizens, and soldiers was subdued, as if the heart of the empire itself hesitated before what was to come. Within the walls of the Palatine Hill, the immutable seat of imperial power, the final moments of Caligula's reign routed themselves through shadowed halls and echoing chambers. This was not an ordinary morning, but one suspended in the breathless tension of history, trembling on the brink. Emperor Caligula, once bright with the exuberance of youth and imperial promise, now resembled a fragile specter trapped beneath the weight of his crown and torments. His form, thin and gaunt, flickered like a failing flame beneath the heavy purple robe that bore the burden of empire. There was in his eyes a haunting vacancy, a mind caught in the churn of delusion, grief, and fractured reality. Frequently, that gaze would sharpen suddenly, as if fighting tides only he could sense, yet just as quickly it would retreat into silence. The man who had terrified and captivated Rome now seemed imprisoned by his own unraveling self. Around him, the palace breathed an uneasy rhythm. Courtiers moved like shadows ensnared in a web of fear and anticipation. Senators, once only too eager to bask in the hesitation of imperial favor, now sat stiff and silent. Each face was a mask carved from anxiety, aware that life now wavered on the thinnest sliver of chance. The Praetorian Guard, sworn protectors of the imperial person, similarly bore the strain, their loyalty taxed by the maddened sway of a ruler slipping beyond reason, yet tempered by fear of fortune's perilous turn. The death of Drusilla, Caligula's beloved sister and companion in both affection and scandal, loomed over the court like a shadow without form. Some sources offer her loss as a turning point, the last fragile anchor in the storm of his mind violently ripped away. In the grim rites Caligula decreed to honor her memory, the boundary between mourning and deranged grandeur was obliterated. Flames roared against the night sky, pyres rising beneath statues and marble born of imperial hubris. This conjured spectacle was less funeral than anguished supplication, an emperor beseeching the heavens for a gift no god could grant, the preservation of fractured sanity. As the day grew, a sinister cadence played softly beneath ritual and routine. Beneath the gilded ceilings and echoing arches, Caligula's engagements brought with them unpredictable shifts. Moments of eerie calm alternated with those of sharp, uncontrolled fury. At times, the emperor would direct his court with cryptic proclamations linking himself to the gods, demanding sacrifices and decrees sealed in divine right. The familiar tone of governance had all but faded, replaced by a theater of menace, where reason was hostage to madness. Banquets became stages for fear. The once praised feasts, lavish, ceremonial, intended to celebrate the empire's strength, now served more macabre purposes. Guests seated around glittering tables exchanged furtive glances, their forced smiles barely masking the pulse of dread. Whispers survive, telling of moments when Caligula would suddenly identify some among the company as victims, their shared meal marking an unspoken death sentence. The knowledge that survival stemmed from the shifting tides of imperial caprice dissolved trust into brittle fragments. Every moment of courtly grace was tinted by the certainty of danger, where loyalty was suspension of disbelief, and a glance could be the last. Behind those velvet drapes and heavy doors were darker secrets. Executions, once public and savage displays of imperial might, slipped into shadowed erasure. Men and women of rank, trusted former friends, slipped quietly into the night, seized without accusation or trial. The cold stones swallowed their desperate cries, leaving only rumors and fading footsteps. Each disappearance was an unspoken terror, fracturing the bonds of power and loyalty that had once held the empire's elite in fragile unity. Amid this growing maelstrom, the Praetorian Guard wrestled with their divided allegiance. The fierce loyalty that had once defined their order softened into quiet, fearful doubt. Murmured plans and loaded silences passed between soldiers, silent resistances taking form in the dim quarters where oath met conscience. The hope that the madness might end even through violence germinated quietly, steadily in the hearts of those sworn to protect the emperor's life. Meanwhile, within the private chambers, Caesonia, the emperor's wife, held a delicate existence. Shielding their infant daughter from the crumbling palace world, her presence wove a thread of fragile humanity into the tapestry of decay. While spared the worst of the public displays of cruelty, her eyes bore witness to a slowly disintegrating world, filled with whispered horrors and unspoken fears. She embodied a quiet hope, the future caught in the tenuous grasp of a child born to sovereign madness. Outside the palace, the city moved onward beneath a shroud of unease. The usual bustling markets and clamoring crowds were muted by the weight of dread. The public festivals intended to honor Rome's gods and heroes had decayed into empty displays of imperial self-worship. Temples once alive with sacred reverence now bore the chilling presence of statues glorifying an emperor who claimed divinity itself, an act that gnawed at the lifeblood of Roman piety and stirred disquiet murmurs among its citizens. Within the Senate, once the arena of political vigor and debate, a weary despair had taken hold. Behind closed doors, men once shielded by power now planned with hushed urgency. The balancing act between obedience and rebellion tested every loyalty. The fear born of Caligula's caprices wrestled with the desperate hope for reprieve. Whispered conspiracies wove their dangerous patterns through stone corridors, fragile but growing in resolve. From that weaving web of desperation and duty, a plan was born. One wrought not from ambition alone, but from a shared conviction that Rome's salvation demanded the severing of madness at its source. Senators bound their fates to the silent patriotism of drawn blades, and disillusioned Praetorian officers pledged themselves to a grim resolution. The shadowy alliance prepared to act, not with fanfare or fury, but with measured solemnity and the heavy weight of necessity. The palatial corridors thickened with anticipation. Servants moved with silent urgency. Conspirators exchanged brief final words, and the city beyond held a breath it had not dared to draw fully for months. The moment of reckoning neared, each sound sharpened in the charged morning stillness. Amid it all, Caligula sat in the throne room, shrouded in the vestiges of his imperial majesty, yet undone by the storm raging within. His erratic proclamations slipped between divine declarations and anguished murmurs. The man transcended, then retreated, caught on the fracturing boundary between human frailty and deified illusion. And then, like the sudden crash of thunder splitting a calm sky, the fatal strike echoed through marbled halls. The conspirators, swift and resolute, enacted their grim duty. In the utter finality of steel meeting flesh, Caligula's reign of terror collapsed into silence. His last breaths carried the weight of shock, rage and loneliness, the echoes of a soul battered by ambition and madness. With the fall of the emperor, the palace became a chaotic landscape, conflicted loyalties sharp and immediate, a scramble for order amid collapse. Rome itself exhaled, trembling between the hope of liberation and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. In the wake of this sudden twilight, Caligula's uncle Claudius emerged swiftly to claim power, his hesitant ascent a beacon offering the fragile promise of restoration. Yet the scars of the fallen reign lingered, etched in the broken trust, fractured families, and whispered memories that would haunt Rome for generations. This moment, dark and decisive, stands as a haunting testament to the perilous nexus between absolute power and fractured sanity. The tragic fall of Caligula reveals the ease with which the brightest throne can cast the darkest shadow, and how vulnerability hides beneath imperial gold. As we step away from these final hours, the echo remains a soft warning preserved through time. The story of a ruler undone by his own excess is also the story of an empire's endurance, its capacity to rise anew from the ashes of madness and cruelty. When you are ready, we will gently turn to the days that followed, the uncertain dawn of a restored empire grappling with its wounds, and the slow reclaiming of Rome's fractured soul. But for now, rest softly beneath the quilt of night, cradled by the quiet sigh of history's lessons whispered gently into the stillness. When you awaken, we will continue together on this journey through the shadows and light of ancient Rome's darkest hours. The next chapter awaits. In the fragile stillness of that final morning, the heavy curtains of Rome's imperial palace fluttered softly, caught in a slight breeze that whispered through the marbled halls. The empire seemed suspended, poised on the trembling edge between what had been and what was yet to come. Caligula, an emperor once radiant with youthful promise and chaos alike, sat diminished in body and spirit, a hollow figure beneath the ornate purple robes that no longer concealed the ravages of illness and despair. His eyes, flickering intermittently with sudden sharpness before fading back into shadows, held the secrets of a mind lost amid its own torment. The air within the palace was thick with tension, a quiet dread that wrapped itself around courtiers and guards in equal measure. Each step echoed lightly on the vast marble floors, carrying with it the weight of whispered conspiracies and unspoken fears. Senators, long silenced by the capricious cruelty of their sovereign, occupied their seats with faces carved from anxiety and resignation. They knew that their survival hinged on delicate calculations where a single word, a fleeting glance, could mark the difference between life and oblivion. Caligula's once brilliant court had degenerated into a realm where trust was a fragile illusion. The emperor's paranoia had cast a vast shadow, turning allies into suspects and counsel into suspicion. His behaviors, erratic, sometimes gentle, often brutal, were unpredictable as the shifting tides, offering no safe harbor to those who surrounded him. Even the Praetorian Guard, resolute protectors of the imperial person, found their loyalty eroding beneath the crushing weight of uncertainty. Whispers of revolt stirred silently among their ranks, hidden beneath careful discipline but growing ever stronger. At the heart of this unraveling was the profound grief that had overtaken Caligula after the death of his sister Drusilla. A rare anchor and companion in his tempestuous life, her passing had rent the fragile threads holding his sanity in place. In the aftermath, his private mourning spilled into public spectacle. Vast pyres that burned into the night, surrounded by flickering torches casting grotesque shadows across marble pillars, and rites that bizarrely mixed imperial ceremony with the emperor's private delusions of divine kinship. Those who bore witness could not help but see a man shattered, his cries to the gods both a plea and a declaration of his own fracturing mind. Grief did not temper his cruelty, it sharpened it. The atmosphere of the palace thickened with dread, as Caligula's whims twisted into merciless games. Banquets transformed into deadly theaters, where guests dared not trust a flattering smile or the favor of a word. From whispered accounts, some diners found themselves marked by silent decree, their shared meal becoming the final stage before their sudden disappearance, dragged away under the cloak of darkness, swallowed by the unforgiving stone walls. This relentless uncertainty tore through the fabric of courtly life, replacing loyalty with brittle fear and solidarity with quiet suspicion. The hidden executions loomed like a specter over the empire's heart. Men and women of power, once secure in their station, vanished quietly without trial or declaration. The cries of the condemned were muffled by cold stone, sealed away in secret chambers where justice had surrendered to terror. Each disappearance fractured the fragile trust binding Rome's elite, leaving courtiers to wonder who would be next, the next shadow to slip from whispered conversation into silence. Amidst this suffocating gloom, the Praetorian Guard grappled with conflicting allegiances. Their oath to protect the emperor warred against burgeoning conscience and the stark reality of the mad tyrant they kept alive. Murmurs of mutiny passed through their ranks under flickering torchlight, and secret meetings forged a grim resolve. The choice loomed: serve a crumbling madness or act to save Rome, even if by his violent end. Caesonia, Caligula's wife, inhabited a fragile sanctuary within this chaos. Shielding their infant daughter from the plague of terror that had overtaken the palace, she stood as a solitary thread of hope amid the empire's collapse. Her presence was at once tender and fraught with quiet fear, a reminder that beneath the layers of imperial excess and cruelty, the fragile human heart still beat, vulnerable and enduring. Beyond the palace, Rome carried on under a mantle of hushed unease. The city's once vibrant streets moved in suppressed rhythms, where rehearsed festival crowds masked a collective wariness. Temples dedicated not to tradition, but to the emperor himself dotted the cityscape, silent monuments to blasphemy and excess. The gods whom Rome had long worshipped were displaced by statues carved in marble, cold, unyielding faces reflecting the fractured soul of an empire torn between reverence and ruin. Within the Senate, the air was thick with despair and cautious plotting. The chamber that had echoed with political theater now became the cradle of conspiracy. Debates gave way to whispers, and alliances formed in the shadow of fear and desperation. Senators calculated the cost of patience against the perils of rebellion, dimly aware that the fate of the empire hung on the precarious edge of choice. The memory of Caligula's ruthless reprisals kept many silenced, yet beneath the surface a quiet determination began to coalesce. From this crucible emerged a plan born of desperation and duty. Senators united with disaffected Praetorian officers, their shared resolve forged in the belief that Rome's salvation required a decisive and brutal cleaving of the present madness. They moved silently beneath the gaze of marble gods, their steps measured and hearts heavy with the knowledge that their action would be both tragic and necessary. As dawn's pale light filtered faintly into the high windows of the palace, the conspirators steadied themselves. Servants moved furtively. Courtiers locked wary eyes. Rome's heartbeat quickened beneath the stillness of the early morning. Caligula sat upon his throne, a lone figure draped in the remnants of imperial majesty, but undone by the storm raging within. His proclamations floated between fevered divinity and anguished despair, the fragile border between man and God dissolving. Then, like a sudden crack splitting the silence, steel flashed in the dim light. The conspirators, swift and resolute, enacted their grim task. Caligula's final breaths, a mixture of shock, anger, and helplessness, faded beneath the cold shadows of the throne room. The mad emperor's tumultuous symphony concluded abruptly, leaving behind a silence that was at once chilling and profound. Chaos erupted in the wake of the assassination, a clash of lingering loyalty and the urgent scramble for order. Rome, trembling between relief and uncertainty, exhaled a breath long held. In the power vacuum, Claudius, Caligula's uncle, was swiftly elevated, his accession signaling the fragile promise of stability and renewal. Yet the scars left by years of madness and brutality remained etched deep in the city's heart, in broken families, fractured trust, and whispered legends that would echo through time. The tragic fall of Emperor Caligula stands as a haunting reminder of the delicate balance between power and madness, where crowns of gold can conceal shadows as deep as night. The tale is not merely of a tyrant's excess, but a sobering meditation on humanity's enduring vulnerability, the perils of absolute power, and the echoes left behind in the ruins of empire. As we leave the final, harrowing chapter of Caligula's life behind, we prepare to explore what came after, the fragile dawn of a Rome aching to rebuild, a city caught between memory and hope, scarred but unbroken. When you are ready, we will journey together into the aftermath, into the heart of an empire seeking peace beyond the shadow of tyranny. Until then, rest gently, with the soft murmur of history's lessons, cradling you through the night. The next chapter awaits. In the solemn quiet of that final dawn, the palace of Emperor Caligula held a fragile stillness, as if time itself hesitated beneath the weight of impending fate. The grand halls, draped in the fading glow of ancient grandeur, bore witness to the final act in a reign marked by grandeur, madness, and terror. Caligula, once the vibrant and unpredictable son of Germanicus, had been reduced to a shadow, a fragile man ensnared by the relentless grip of paranoia, grief, and the monstrous burden of imperial power. His physical form was thin and waning, his once sharp features now hollowed by months of illness and sorrow. The mantle of purple that signified his dominion hung loosely upon his weary frame, a heavy shroud to a man whose spirit had long since begun to fracture. Those eyes, once fiery with youth and ambition, flickered uncertainly between moments of lucidity and overwhelming despondency, like distant stars flickering through the evening mist. It is in this image, the emperor's fragile silhouette framed against marble and gold, that the last hours took shape. Within the vast palace, courtiers and senators moved cautiously, their steps softened by the weight of fear and an unspoken understanding that the end was near. The luxury that had once so dazzled now seemed oppressive, the opulence a cruel mask over a festering court, seething with distrust and dread. Men who had once sought Caligula's favor with eager tongues now sat in uneasy silence, their faces carved from anxiety as they navigated the perilous terrain of imperial whim. Each gesture, each glance carried the possibility of favor or fatal consequence. The Praetorian Guard, sworn protectors of the emperor's life, found their loyalty strained beyond endurance. No longer could they ignore the mounting terror that had poisoned the palace. In whispered shadows, plans had been laid, fragile conspiracies born from desperation and a yearning for the empire's salvation. Among them moved Cassius Chaerea, once a loyal officer, now the instrument of history's severing blade. His heart was heavy, burdened by the knowledge that through his hand Rome might be freed from madness, but at the expense of blood and chaos. Caligula's recent days had been marked by a haunting blend of fevered delusion and desolate grief. The death of his sister Drusilla, a figure shrouded in both affection and scandal, had rent the last fragile tether to his waning sanity. Rites held in her memory had transformed the palace into a surreal theater, where flames danced against the night sky, reflecting in the anguished faces of courtiers caught between devotion and terror. The emperor's rituals, blending imperial ceremony with his own desperate claims of divine kinship, cast long shadows over the corridors, shadows from which hope had fled. This loss plunged Caligula into deeper isolation. His commands became erratic and strangled by despair, alternating between grandiose proclamations of eternal rule and moments of hollow silence. In these hours, banquet halls bore witness to grim performances, feasts where laughter lay thin, and every participant sensed the precariousness of survival. Stories whisper of silent sentences cast amid overflowing cups, as those once favored suddenly vanished into darkness, their fates sealed by inscrutable whims. Such cruel games shattered the fragile veneer of loyalty and replaced it with suffocating dread. Behind the palace walls, more than mere fear rippled through the empire's veins. Executions, once public and savage, now occurred in the shadows, ghostly erasures that silenced senators, generals, and servants alike. These vanishings were swift and secret, cutting through the web of trust that held Rome's elite together. Each disappearance echoed like a silent scream in the marble halls, a reminder of how fully the reign of terror had suffused the imperial heart. Even the Praetorian Guard, once the pride and power of Rome's security, were fractured by internal struggles. The sacred oath to protect the emperor waged war with a growing sense of duty to the empire at large. Murmurs of mutiny and retribution circulated beneath the torchlit watch of the barracks. The line between protector and assassin blurred, and men once united found themselves poised on the brink of history. Amidst this growing maelstrom stood Caesonia, Caligula's wife, herself a fragile figure navigating the labyrinth of fear entwined with love. Beside her rested their infant daughter, child of an empire on the cusp of transformation. Caesonia's quiet presence embodied the human endurance that survives even amidst ruin, a slender thread of hope weaving through the terror and decay. Outside the palace, the city itself breathed a subdued and uncertain breath. The once vibrant streets moved beneath a canopy of hushed whispers and covert glances, the grand temples and statues of the emperor casting unnatural shadows across the forum and beyond. The Roman gods, displaced in favor of an emperor's declared divinity, seemed eclipsed, their temples silent witnesses to a faith fractured by blasphemy and despair. Within the Senate chamber, A grim calculus prevailed. Men who had once vied for power now harbored whispered resolves, their ambitions tempered by the weight of survival. The balance between submission and rebellion wavered precariously. Conversations carried undertones of danger and possibility. To those plotting in hidden corners, the fate of Rome was bound to the resolution soon to be enacted within these very walls. In the measured breath before the storm, conspirators gathered in quiet corners of the palace, their voices hushed but resolute. They carried the heavy knowledge that their chosen act was both a sacrifice and an offering, a violent severing of the thread-binding madness to power. Through corridors lined with statues of gods and emperors past, they moved like shadows, laced with a sober conviction. Caligula, for his part, sat oblivious or perhaps resigned in the throne room, draped in the fading glory of his purple robes. His proclamations, still laced with delusions of divinity, echoed faintly against marble walls, shadows of a grandeur undone by the erosion of reason and grief. The man who had once ruled a vast empire now faced the silence that precedes oblivion, a silence pierced only briefly by the swift, merciless stroke of steel. The moment arrived with terrible swiftness. The conspirators, steeled by months of anguish and resolve, moved with a deadly precision born of necessity. Caligula's final breath, a mixture of shock, rage, and hopelessness, dissolved into the cold air of the throne room. The cacophony of power and madness fell abruptly into silence. In the immediate aftermath, chaos erupted, a violent clash of loyalty and trepidation, a desperate scramble for control amid the shattering of an empire's most terrible nightmare. News of the emperor's death spread swiftly, carried in whispers and cries through the streets, reaching the ears of a city both relieved and uncertain. Into this void stepped Claudius, Caligula's uncle, whose swift ascension brought a fragile hope of restoration. Yet the wounds inflicted by a reign of excess and terror lingered, deep fissures in trust and governance that would take generations to heal. The stories of Caligula's final days, marked by unchecked cruelty and tragic human frailty, entered the annals of Rome's memory, a cautionary echo across time. The demise of Caligula offers a solemn reflection on the peril that shadows great power when unmoored from temperance and humanity. His tale, at once tragic and terrifying, reminds us that the brightest crowns may hide the deepest darkness, and that even the mightiest can fall when madness takes root. As we close this chapter, we do so with a quiet reverence for the human stories entwined with imperial fate, the grief, fear, and fragile hope that persist beyond the fall of an emperor. When you are ready, we will continue our journey into the days that followed, the fragile dawn of a Rome seeking to reclaim its soul amidst the shadows of its own history. For now, rest gently, cradled by the stillness of ancient stone and whispered legends, as the solemn echoes of Caligula's final days fade softly into the night. The next chapter awaits. In the soft hush of morning's first light, the shadows of Caligula's reign finally began to dissolve, folding gently into the folds of history as a city and an empire prepared to wake from a nightmare long endured. His story, a turbulent symphony of promise, madness, and destruction, had reached its final note, leaving behind echoes that would whisper through the ages. The man who had once captivated Rome with his charisma, whose youthful energy had sparked hope and excitement, had become a figure consumed by darkness. His final days, marked by fragile health, overwhelming grief, and relentless paranoia, painted a portrait not simply of a tyrant's ruin, but of a deeply human struggle against the tides of circumstance and mind. The weight of loss, the devastating death of Drusilla, the isolation within a gilded cage of power, the torment of his unraveling thoughts, had stripped away much of the grandeur that once surrounded his rule, revealing the fragile man beneath the purple robes. Within the walls of the imperial palace, calm finally gave way to the decisive act that would end Caligula's tragic descent. The conspirators, driven not by mere ambition, but by a somber sense of duty to Rome itself, acted swiftly and deliberately. Their blades, borne not with glee but with heavy hearts, severed the reign of terror born from unchecked power and fractured sanity. In that swift moment, the fragile balance between absolute rule and human frailty shattered irrevocably. As the dust settled, Rome exhaled a breath long held in fear. The city, scarred by years of cruelty and chaos, now stood at a crossroads, the path ahead uncertain, yet promising a return to order and healing. The ascension of Claudius, Caligula's uncle, offered the fragile hope of renewal, a chance to rebuild from ruins still warm with recent tragedy. Yet the echoes of the mad emperor's excesses lingered, etched into the collective memory of a people all too aware of the dangers born when power escapes the bounds of reason. Reflecting on this somber chapter, it is essential to remember that Caligula was not solely a figure of darkness and terror. He was also a man caught in the relentless grip of circumstance, steeped in personal loss, and imprisoned by his own mind. His reign was a kaleidoscope of human vulnerabilities, where ambition blurred into delusion, and brilliance devolved into madness. Through this lens, his story becomes more than a cautionary tale of tyranny. It is a haunting meditation on the human condition itself, the delicate balance we all navigate between control and chaos, reason and despair. In the quiet that follows, we might listen not only to the horrors of imperial excess, but also to the softer echoes of tragedy and sorrow hidden beneath. For within every empire's rise and fall are the fragile lives intertwined, individual souls shaped by the tides of history, struggling with hope, fear, and the universal search for meaning. Caligula's final days stand as a gentle reminder that beneath every crown, every throne, there lies a human heart, prone to falter, to break, and perhaps to find peace at last. Thank you for accompanying this journey through one of history's darkest recesses. If you found solace in these whispered stories from the past, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue to explore the shadows of history with a voice both soothing and thoughtful. If this tale brought you reflection or calm, a like on this video would be deeply appreciated. Tonight, as your thoughts drift gently toward rest, let the story of Caligula's reign fade softly into the quiet night, leaving behind not only the memory of madness but a lingering quiet hope that even in the depths of human darkness, understanding and peace may one day emerge. Sleep softly, until we meet again in the gentle embrace of history's next whispered tale.